Hi class, welcome to week 2. This week we're covering major perspectives of psychology. We will be covering chapter 1, most of chapter 1 in OpenStax. Remember, your required readings are already embedded into the Canvas modules. And we're also going to be covering one section of chapter 9 on developmental theories. Chapter 9 covers lifespan development, very exciting chapter. If you love the theories we're learning about this week, as well as if you peek through chapter 9, you might want to take Psych 240, which is lifespan development. So here we go. I wanted to introduce you to some brief history of psychology. So this is a reading section in your book. Psychology is based on psyche, mind, logos, study of. So sociology is study of societies. Psychology, study the mind. When we study psychology, it is a scientific basis. We're going to learn about the research methods and more about science with psychology next week in chapter 2. My image video for the video is covering up the 4 goals, which we're going to learn about next week. So we have our roots in philosophy. The first kind of father of psychology is Wilhelm Wundt. He wanted to study the mind and did so in a laboratory. So he was a German physician. He was one of the first individuals to try to look at this idea of consciousness, our awareness of what we're doing, our behaviors, and those kinds of observations. So there's a meme for him, turned down for what? I could play the same song, but I'm not that tech to enter that. And so his ideas come in roots of structuralism and functionalism. Again, this idea of consciousness is awareness. So structures is trying to figure out and hypothesize and research those different components and parts of our consciousness and our actions, and functionalism is looking at more of those behaviors or those operations. You're going to see, if you were to take a course in history of psychology, which is typically offered at a university, there's different movements we've had, and then those movements have become part of our modern perspectives of psychology. So a movement that was after Wilhelm Wundt with structuralism and functionalism was psychoanalysis. So psychoanalysis is kind of that cliche, a person sitting on a couch during therapy. So there is a type of therapy that is from psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis, they moved from, hey, we have things going on in our mind that we're not aware of. This idea of consciousness and unconsciousness and subconsciousness. So we have different levels of consciousness, which we're going to get to later in the semester. But this psychoanalysis, the father of psychoanalysis was Sigmund Freud. So you might have heard the term, oh, you're so anal. That term anal is actually referring to a stage in Freud's developmental theory, which we're not going to focus too much on because it's more for fun than scientifically based. So he did start to help us realize we've got these different layers or levels of consciousness. And so psychoanalysis, which we can also call a psychodynamic approach, is one of our major perspectives. We also had a movement of, hey, let's forget about these areas of consciousness and what's going on in our minds. We are influenced by our environment, and let's talk about behavior. And that became to a movement of behavioralism. And so behavioralism is looking at our learned associations. So how do you get kids to learn how to go potty, or dogs to learn how to go potty? You train them and reward them and punish them. And so that's part of behavioralism. So we're going to learn more about that in a whole chapter. So again, we're going to see these different movements as whole chapters. And so let's get to those modern perspectives of psychology. Your book brings up developmental psychology as an area of psychology, kind of a perspective, but developmental is more eclectic. It consumes aspects of social development, emotional development, cognitive development, which is our thinking, as well as physical development. And we're going to talk more about some major developmental theories in a minute. So, major perspectives of psychology. We've got 7 major perspectives. Of those 7, we've got chapters on almost all of them, except for evolutionary psych, so I won't talk too much about that. Psychodynamic has its roots in Freud, psychoanalysis, looking at those levels of consciousness and realizing there's sometimes we don't realize why we do things. So that's that level of unconscious urges. So we're going to actually learn more about Freud's theory next week when we talk about personality development. And we're going to see psychodynamic or psychoanalysis, this perspective, kind of weave in and out through some of our chapters, especially when we get to the end of the semester, when we start talking about therapy and treatment in abnormal behavior. Behavioral is another movement. We're looking at our environment. How does our environment influence us? What can we learn just by observational learning, seeing what's going on in the environment? If I saw another kid get punished, I might not decide to do that action because I don't want to get punished. So that's behavioralism. We're going to have a whole chapter on that. It's going to be our learning chapter. Also connected to learning is our consciousness, levels of consciousness, which connects to some of our cognitive perspective, which is our thinking. So when we have an awareness of what we're doing, I'm feeling sad, this is really hard for me to focus on, those are all things that have to do with our memory, information processing, and attention. So we're going to have a whole chapter on memory and attention connected to cognitive psych. We're also going to see aspects of cognitive psych tie into our perception and sensation chapter. Biopsychosocial is connecting to learning about the mind-body connections. So this is going to hit us when we talk about stress, what goes on with our stress response system, and how we can calm ourselves down. This will also connect to our chapter on brains, learning about areas of the brains, function of the brains, as also our neurons. So that's the biopsychosocial perspective, which will also again tie into some of our therapy with abnormal psych, as well as the behavioral connects to therapy, cognitive connects to therapy. One of our last perspectives I'm going to highlight is humanistic. Humanistic comes from this idea of we're uniquely human. We have more advanced thoughts than maybe dogs or other species. And we want to become the best possible version of ourselves. So it's connected to positive psychology. The Army slogan, be all you can be, is coming from one of our researchers, one of our theorists for humanistic theory. And we're going to learn a little bit more about humanistic theory when we talk about personalities, ways to better ourselves and understand ourselves. And then the last one that's going to connect, especially for our social psychology chapter, as well as kind of weaved in through a number of different chapters, which is also going to connect to aspects of sensation and perception. And cognitive psychology is this general idea of social cultural. So social cultural is understanding our environment really influences us. And we can look at that in terms of what's happened historically. We can look at that in terms of social norms, social values, social experiences, and then of course culture. So those are our major perspectives. And again, we're going to see bits and pieces of all these, except for the evolutionary one, throughout the semester. This is a breadth class, so we're learning lots of different things about psychology. And the great thing is this is the intro class, so there will be a lot of other classes you can take if you're like, ooh, I like that. Some of them are offered at the community college, some of them are offered at the university. So I now want to dive into some of our developmental theories briefly. So I'm focused on 4 developmental theories. Some of them connect to cognition. Some of them connect to social cultural development. Some of them connect to psychodynamic or psychoanalysis. So I'm going to highlight each one as we go through those connections. Our first developmental theory is Jean Piaget. He is interested in how our thinking changes throughout our lifespan. So he's a stage theorist. Stage theorists feel like we change, almost like a metamorphosis. You could use the analogy for a stage theory. They're going to see a child as a caterpillar and then a chrysalis and then a butterfly. And so that's the kind of thing. Piaget says kids who are 0 to 2 think in very different ways than 2 to 7, to 7 to 11, to 12. Now, Piaget, he's really focused on the ways of thinking, and the age ranges are more estimates. So it is a 4-stage theory. You can see in the graphic. And it is based on this idea of we organize information by schemas. And to get to the next stage, you go through a schema shift. Well, how do you go through schema shifts? Each day the child encounters a new environment. Piaget would say child is very exploratory. A child is like a little scientist. They're either going to assimilate, and that means that information I see matches what I already have stored in my head, or I'm going to accommodate. I see something in the environment doesn't match with what I'm thinking or how I think about things, and so I change the way I think, and that's accommodation. So you accommodate a guest. You change what you do to accommodate your guest. That's kind of what our brain does. So 0 to 2 is called sensory motor because that's basically what babies are thinking about and doing. I've got to figure out how to suck on this bottle and then suck on this toy, and then move things around once I get coordinated with my motor skills. So sensory motor, all about learning our senses, learning about our motor skills. Then we start having language, realizing language is a symbol. I can say the word milk and know, hey, that's something I drink and I really like. So pre-operational, they've got this idea of symbols and they're very imaginative and they're egocentric. And what I mean by egocentric is basically their viewpoint is how everyone else should see the world. And so my son might get really upset because I say that we're going to go and get some shot, take our sister to the doctor and go get some shots. And he might start crying. And then I ask him what's going on. He's like, I don't want shots. And he's just so focused on himself. He doesn't realize, no, you're not getting shots. Your sister is. 7 to 11, we are able to conserve. So we have concrete operations. By conserve, you pass conservation tasks, which is a cool paradigm Piaget developed. We've got a video of that to see. It's really great. Kids understand if you have 2 different glasses and the same amount of liquid, they might look different. It's the same amount, but it's distributed differently based on how that container is. And so that's liquid conservation. And then formal operations, now we kind of think less in the black and white. And so if I were to ask you questions, oh my gosh, what would it be like if men had babies and were pregnant? A kid in formal operation might entertain that discussion. A kid in concrete would be like, men don't have babies if they learned about babies. Babies are carried by women. So that's Piaget in a little nutshell. 4 stages, cognitive, all about how we think, changes how we think. Our next stage is a lifespan stage. Erikson, it's psychoanalysis, which connects to psychodynamics. So he's kind of like a descendant of Freud's thinking, these different layers of consciousness. So he has us go through 8 stages throughout our lifespan. You can see those pictured. Each one has its own psychosocial crisis. And what that means is we have a task, a psychosocial emotional task that's a theme during that time frame of our life. And we're going to go through that time frame of our life. And at the end of it, we are either going to leave with a tool in our toolbox, which is a positive outcome, or we're going to leave with some baggage. And so we move through, Erikson's theory is based on age. We move through these. We have these different outcomes, a tool in the toolbox or baggage, and that's going to impact who we are and how we behave. So as an example, you can see in infancy. Infancy is trust versus mistrust. This is an obvious thing with infants. They are so dependent on others to survive. So I'm either going to have a caregiver that's responsive and communicates with me and gives me what I need so I develop trust, or I'm not. And I'm going to leave that scenario with mistrust. And then that is going to, according to Erikson, going to impact my relationships in the future. All right. So you can see those different themes. Early childhood autonomy is a sense of independence. So do they feel like they can get I can, or are they going to be shame and doubt? So shame and doubt could come from being punished and being shamed during potty training. That could leave a child feeling, oh, I don't know about myself and what I can and can't do. And then preschool initiative versus guilt, again, more of that I can perspective being nurtured. School, industry versus inferiority. School age, we start to compare ourselves with our peers. So industry is being productive, feeling like I can keep doing things versus feeling like I'm not so great about things. So maybe having a less of a self-confidence, comparing myself to peers. Adolescence is identity. Young adulthood is building relationships. Middle adulthood is generativity versus stagnation. I look back and I start to see, what have I given to society? What have I left? How have I made my mark? How have I been generative in my community or with my family or with my work? And then our ending stage is maturity, where I feel like ego integrity is I've held a good life, I've lived a good life, versus feeling like I haven't been fulfilled. So that's Erikson's theory. Another developmental theory is Vygotsky. He again is connected with cognitive development, how we learn things, but in a social cultural lens. So Piaget kind of ignored what kind of environment you lived in. He thought kids are explorers, they figure things out, they learn things. And then Vygotsky really said, you really are impacted by your culture. So if I don't go through formal schooling, but I'm helping my mom in the market, selling flowers or selling candy, I might learn math that way versus learning it by rote memorization with things in a classroom setting. And that's going to impact how I learn things. So how do we learn things? So this is a very influential theory for education. How do I learn things? Well, we learn things through society and our culture. We learn things through scaffolding or guided participation. We can use those two terms interchangeably. What that basically means is, how is another individual, we can call an expert, teaching me, the novice? So it's the case of, let's say your grandma needs to learn how to use email. You would help her. You'd watch her on the computer and you'd help her actively learn the steps. And she would start to internalize those steps. So then all of a sudden you get an email from her saying, hey, I figured it out. That's scaffolding. It's showing that individual and teaching that individual through active learning so that they can do something independently. So this connects to that zone of proximal development, which is the targets above. So zone of proximal development, I have a small zone of proximal development when I don't need a lot of help. I can do things independently. I have a large zone of proximal development where I need a lot of guidance. So think about it, when you first learned how to read, you needed a lot of assistance learning the phonetics, learning sounding things out, learning the irregulars, learning sight words. You needed lots of assistance. And then all of a sudden you learned those skills, you started to internalize those rules, and you're reading independently. All right, so that's zone of proximal development. So educators will sometimes use that as a guide. Where is that child in that learning process for math or for reading, etc.? So that's Vygotsky. And then our last developmental theory connects with moral development. So moral development, Lawrence Kohlberg, he developed this clever paradigm, which is, he actually had several scenarios, but the one that's been shared out publicly is the Heinz dilemma. So if you're curious about that, you can read about that more in the textbook. But you're given this scenario, and then you're asking the individual, what would you decide and why? So in the case of Heinz, he has to decide, is he going to steal a drug to save his wife's life or is he not? And then, so they need to answer what they would do, but the important thing is the why. Again, Lawrence Kohlberg's theory is cognitively based because the importance in classifying individuals according to these three levels is based on what they say and what rationale do they give. So these three different levels, you can see there's a pre-conventional, which is level 1. There's a conventional, which is level 2. And then there's a post-conventional, which is level 3. These three levels you can build into 6 different stages, but we're just going to focus on more of the global 3 levels. Pre-conventional is really interested in, you want to avoid punishment or you want to think about the reward. So avoiding punishment, he's not going to steal it because he doesn't want to get in trouble. He doesn't want to go to jail, all right? Versus he isn't going to steal it because the law says not to steal. His family would feel really upset with him for breaking the law. Again, there's different scenarios and how you can go through and rationalize, but you look at why they said it. So if it's about self-interest, all about Heinz, or punishment and rewards, that's level 1. Younger kids tend to think in more concrete ways and think about that. And then we start connecting to society's rules and regulations. So maybe he is going to save his wife. He is going to steal because he has a marriage with his wife. And that's really important to him. So that's kind of looking at an aspect of level 2 with law and order, morality. And then level 3 is higher order, thinking about I've internalized society's rules, I've thought about my own beliefs, and I'm coming up with a more critical thinking aspect of this. In principle is that highest order of level 3, which we would say someone like Mother Teresa or Gandhi would be at. So that's the moral development in a nutshell. Thanks for watching, and I hope this helped.